If I had known that fate would appoint me as the night watchman of the ancient Moskovitz cemetery at the far edge of this misty and desolate town, I would have thought twice before signing that contract. But the realities of life sometimes force a person to face their deepest fears. My name is Elias. I was an ordinary man in my mid-30s, trying to escape the burdens of my past. I accepted this job to get away from the chaos of the city and find a silence that would quiet my conscience. But at Blackwood Cemetery, there was much more than silence. There was an endless, ancient reckoning both above and beneath the soil. I will never forget the look in the eyes of Mr. Arthur, the old watchman before me. On my first day, there was more than just exhaustion in his eyes. It was as if he was staring into a bottomless abyss. "Listen, lad," he said with a trembling voice. "This place is not like any other. The earth here hides not just bodies, but sometimes restless souls and entities without tongues. Keep your prayers close, your heart pure, and never answer any sound you hear after midnight. They only call out the moment you answer. You sign the invitation in your own blood." At the time, I thought these words were merely the superstitions of an old man. In reality, Mr. Arthur wasn't giving me a warning. He was giving me a survival manual. The cemetery was situated on a steep, rugged slope outside the town. The shadows of the old cypress trees stretched over the graves like giant claws in the moonlight. The watchman's hut was a 2-story stone structure right next to the rusted iron gate, smelling of dampness and age. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. I helped with burials during the day and spent my evenings taking short rounds with my lantern and reading old books in my hut. But on the 40th night, in that eerie silence where even the wind died down, everything changed. It was well past midnight. As the kettle hissed softly on the stove, a sound rose from the oldest section of the cemetery, from those decaying Victorian monuments. It wasn't a scream or the howling of the wind. It sounded as if thousands of people were whispering something simultaneously in a deep, muffled voice. I grabbed my lantern and stepped outside. The air was much colder than usual. My breath hung in the air like a white shroud. As I walked toward the section of the ancient graves, those whispers suddenly ceased. They were replaced by a metallic scraping sound that set my teeth on edge, as if someone were dragging a heavy, rusted chain across the marble sarcophagi. When I turned my lantern toward the sound with a trembling hand, my blood ran cold. Standing by a freshly dug, empty grave that gaped like a dark mouth was a tall, humanoid shadow with a completely distorted anatomy. Its arms reached down to its knees, while its legs were as thin as twigs compared to its imposing torso. Most terrifying of all was its head. Its neck was bent backward at an impossible angle, like a taut bow. I remembered the old Celtic legends my grandmother used to tell. We were not alone in this world. Between the light and the dark, there were ancient beings that had breathed beneath the earth since time immemorial. It was clear that this creature had nothing holy about it, evident from the heavy stench of rotting flesh it emitted and the indescribable unease that shrouded my soul. As my heart hammered against my ribs, I clutched the silver cross around my neck and began to whisper the oldest Latin prayers of protection I knew. My tongue felt heavy and the words knotted in my throat. The moment I uttered, "Libera nos a malo," deliver us from evil, the entity suddenly snapped toward me. It had no face. There were only two vast, coal-black voids for eyes, and its mouth was a vertical gash that opened down to its chest. At that moment, Mr. Arthur's words echoed in my ears. "Do not answer. Just pray." I wanted to turn and bolt, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The creature didn't walk upon the earth. It glided like a sinister mist. As it drew closer, I felt the oxygen vanish from the air and my chest tighten. Just then, a silhouette appeared from the other end of the figure with a snow-white beard, wearing an ancient but majestic priest's robe. He struck his silver-headed staff onto the ground 3 times. In that instant, the dark weight surrounding me shattered like glass. The horrific creature let out a piercing, ear-splitting shriek and dissolved into the earth, vanishing from sight. The white-bearded figure looked at me, smiled as if to say, "Remain in peace," with his eyes alone, and dissipated into the night mist like smoke. My knees gave out, and I collapsed onto the ground right there. When I woke up the next morning, I found myself back in the hut. As I tried to recall the night's events, an old object on the table that didn't belong to me caught my eye. It was an ancient amber rosary, engraved with Latin protection, prayers, and archaic symbols. I realized then that I wasn't alone that night. In Blackwood Cemetery, there were not only forces of darkness but also ancient, spiritual guardians watching over the grounds. Yet, deep in my heart, I felt that these attacks were not the end, but merely a terrifying beginning. Throughout the second week, the sound of fingernails scratching against my windows began every night. On some nights, something would rattle the door, trying to force its way in, but it couldn't enter. Following Mr. Arthur's advice, I had lined the thresholds and windows with blessed salt and engraved ancient symbols of protection. One night, I heard my mother's voice from right behind the door. "Elias, my son, open the door. It's so cold out here. I'm freezing. Let me in," she pleaded. The voice was so realistic, so full of tenderness, that for a moment my hand reflexively reached for the handle. But then I remembered my mother was thousands of miles away, back in the old country. This was one of the greatest deceptions of those dark entities, mimicking the form or voice of a loved one to lure you out. As I began to shout out prayers, the tender voice behind the door instantly twisted into a savage, bestial growl. The door shook with such violence I thought the hinges would snap. Plaster began to flake off the stone walls. In that moment, I realized Blackwood was not just a cemetery. It was built upon the ruins of an ancient sect that had lived on these lands centuries ago, practicing forbidden rites. Beneath the soil lay a massive darkness that had not yet fully awakened. The next day, I began searching for the old records Mr. Arthur had mentioned. Hidden between the rotting floorboards in the attic of the hut, I found an ancient, leather-bound journal. The book spoke of the Whispering Wells, beneath this graveyard, and a tribe of ancient, malevolent beings known as the Myrtlemen who guarded them. This tribe fed on human sorrow and sought to snatch souls before they could find eternal rest. On one page of the journal, there was a chilling note: "If you hear weeping coming from beneath the earth, do not dig. That which cries is not the dead. It is a trap designed to pull you into the grave." That night, in the very center of the cemetery, I saw a flickering light over the grave of a recently buried young woman. It looked like the dying flame of a gas lantern. Overcome by curiosity and a strange sense of pity, I moved toward it. As I drew closer, I heard a muffled voice coming from beneath the earth. It was a woman's desperate plea. "Help me. They buried me alive. I can't breathe. Save me," she wailed. Instinctively, I grabbed the shovel. Just as I was about to strike the earth, I felt the ancient amber rosary in my pocket grow burning hot, as if searing my skin. I pulled my hand back. It was then I noticed the flowers on the grave. Instead of being withered, they were vivid and blood, as if watered with fresh gore. Suddenly, the voice from the grave shifted. The desperate woman's cry turned into a horrifying noise, like the simultaneous hissing of 1,000 vipers. The ground began to shake violently. From within the grave, long, black, and hairy hands emerged, gripping my wrists and dragging me toward that dark pit. The hands were so powerful I could hear my wrist bones cracking. "The Creator is the only true power, and He is over all things," I shouted. I began to recite the ancient prayers of protection with every ounce of strength. Just then, a bolt of lightning tore through the sky, and every corner of the cemetery was flooded with a blinding, white light, as if the gates of heaven had momentarily opened. The hands that held me recoiled, as if they had touched molten iron. The wailing from beneath the soil gave way to a heavy, profound silence. I was gasping for air. On my wrists were black, burned like marks left by those hands. When I returned to the hut and looked in the mirror, I saw that my temples had turned stark white. I had aged a decade in a single night. Yet, I could not run. If I left now, these dark entities would break free and scatter into the homes of the innocent townspeople. I was no longer just a watchman. I was a guardian standing on that thin, dangerous line between this world and the next. As I knelt for my morning prayers, I felt others standing in line behind me. There was no one visible, but the warmth and serenity of standing, shoulder to shoulder with unseen protectors, filled my entire being. I believed that the ancient guardians were reminding me that I was not alone. When I finished and rose, a thick, fresh scent of roses filled the room. It was the final consolation before the great battle that awaited me. Around noon, Father Thomas, an old friend of Mr. Arthur, arrived at the cemetery. He looked deeply into my eyes. "Your time is running out, my son," he said. "Tonight is the night of the great convergence. The moon will eclipse, and the ancient well beneath this cemetery will open. If you do not seal that well, not only this cemetery, but the entire town will be plunged into darkness. Prepare yourself." We shall descend into the heart of that darkness together. Father Thomas and I went to the oldest, most desolate corner of the cemetery. There stood a massive stone slab covered in strange, forbidden symbols reminiscent of pagan pre-Christian eras. The area around the stone was littered with the carcasses of birds that had died for no apparent reason. Father Thomas pulled a bottle of holy water from beneath his robe, poured it over the stone, and began to chant in an ancient tongue. The moment the water touched the symbols on the stone, it began to smoke and hiss as if acid had been poured upon it. This, Father Thomas said, his voice echoing like a warning, is the sealed tomb of a warlock from an age before humanity truly understood the depths of darkness. This man sold his soul to dark powers while he lived, and he sealed his own remains within this well, Father Thomas said, his voice echoing like a low rumble in the wind. Every century, this seal weakens and demands a sacrifice. If they cannot find it, legions of entities will spill onto the earth. Your pure faith and prayers have held them back until now, but the true war begins tonight. As the sun set, the sky bled a deep blood-red hue. The old cypress trees in the graveyard twisted and writhed as if in agony. The birds went silent, and the wind died completely. I could only hear that rhythmic, booming sound coming from deep beneath the earth, the sound of a colossal heart beating. Together with Father Thomas, we drew a circle of protection around the well using blessed salt, sage, and rue seeds. Our only weapons were our unshakable faith and our holy texts. As midnight approached, the moon slowly began to darken. At that very moment, shadows began to rise from every corner of the cemetery. Tens of thousands of them. Some were stunted, some grotesquely tall, and others were entirely beastly in form. Their eyes all glowed with an insatiable hunger. They began to circle our barrier. They could not enter, but the sounds they emitted were horrific enough to shatter a man's mind. Father Thomas roared, "Do not fear, Elias. They are merely phantoms of the darkness. Do not let the light of your faith be extinguished." Just then, the heavy stone slab atop the well slid aside with a ground-shaking roar. A pitch-black, suffocating fog billowed out from the depths. From within that mist, a massive entity emerged, wearing a crown made of human bones. This was the leader of the Myrtilon Legion, the ancient servant of the warlock. The creature lunged toward Father Thomas. Instantly, the air turned freezing, and our breath turned to ice. The father raised his ancient, leather-bound, holy book high into the air and began to recite the scriptures with a voice that drowned out the thunder. As he chanted, the shroud of darkness over the moon began to tear apart, and a brilliant, searing light descended from the heavens onto the earth. The leader of the entities began to melt and disintegrate under that celestial light. Yet, with a final, desperate move, it turned toward me and whispered into my ear with an icy, deadly breath, "We never end. We exist within the smallest shadow of doubt in your heart." At that moment, I hesitated for a fraction of a second. What if we failed? That split second of doubt tore a tiny breach in our circle of protection. A shadow entity seeped through the gap and lunged at me. The coldness of its fingers around my throat felt as if it had risen from the deepest pits of hell. Just when I thought all was lost, the amber rosary in my pocket shattered. Each bead transformed into a beam of light, piercing right through the entity. That heirloom from Mr. Arthur had saved my life. When Father Thomas finished the final prayer and pressed his hand against the stone slab, a massive explosion shook the earth. The grave seemed to come alive, as if bearing witness, and in that instant, all those dark entities dissolved into smoke and ascended into the heavens. The moon returned to its brilliant, silvery hue. By the first light of dawn, we saw that all the cursed symbols on the stone slab had vanished, leaving it as nothing more than an ordinary, moss-covered rock. Father Thomas smiled, weary but peaceful. "A door has closed tonight, my son," he said. "But remember, this world is a place of trial. One door closes and another opens. Continue your watch." I never heard those terrifying sounds in the cemetery again. Now I know that no matter how powerful the darkness may be, even a single candle flame is enough to scatter it, especially if that light is the radiance of faith and Holy Scripture. No evil can stand against it. Yet, peace is often a veil. Darkness loves to seep through the doors left ajar by small not just in great battles. One midnight, as the moon hung like a sliver of a crescent in the sky, I felt a strange movement in the furthest corner of the cemetery, the place where that sealed well lay. Normally, I would hesitate to step there at night, for it was no longer just a pile of stones to me. It was a sacred trust, Nevertheless, an uncontrollable unease compelled me to go. As I walked, the air temperature plummeted, and the earth beneath my feet trembled as if it were a living creature. When I reached the spot, I encountered a substance on the stone slab we had sealed that I had never seen before. A thick, pitch-black liquid was slowly seeping from the edges, burning the soil wherever it touched as if it were acid. This was not a mere haunting, it was a sign that someone or something was trying to erode the ancient seal from the outside through a forbidden ritual. Despite the lack of wind, the branches of the trees above the graveyard shook violently, and the leaves began to fall as if being shredded by unseen hands. I swept my lantern around. The light caught silhouettes darting rapidly between the graves. These were not the these were grave rites, wretched beings that took pleasure in graves and tormenting the restless souls within. They surrounded me in an instant. They were countless, morphing into different forms. Some took the shape of massive, distorted wolves, while others appeared as grotesque abominations stitched together from mismatched human limbs. For a moment, fear tightened its grip on my throat. Then, I remembered the words Father Thomas had left me as a testament. They feed on your fear. If you bury your fear with total surrender to the divine, they cannot touch you. I took a deep breath, centered my spirit, and began to recite the most powerful prayers of protection aloud. My voice sliced through the suffocating silence of the cemetery like a sharp blade. As I began to chant, the entities didn't retreat. They became even more aggressive. One of them lunged at my throat with claws made of shadows. At that moment, I felt a power surging through my veins that I had never known before. It was not my own strength. It was a divine armor granted by the Holy Scriptures. I gestured into the air as if breaking through a barrier. The dark masses lunging at me were repelled as if striking an invisible wall. But I realized something. These creatures hadn't arrived here on their own. Someone was performing a ritual behind the high stone wall just outside the cemetery. I shouldn't have looked, perhaps, but my instincts drove me to that wall. Beneath a massive, withered oak tree, a figure stood dressed in a deep black, tattered robe, their face hidden behind an unsettling mask. In the stranger's hand was a tome covered in strange symbols, and before him burned a bizarre, black fire that emitted a sickening scent. When he turned his head toward me, I saw no human spark in his eyes, no sign of life. He was human, perhaps, but his soul had long since departed. He was a necromancer. He didn't seem surprised to see me. Instead, his lips twisted into a crooked smile. "Your watch will not last long, watchman," he said. His voice sounded like a moan rising from the bowels of the earth. "The seal will shatter, and the master within shall be set free." I dropped my lantern and clutched the remaining beads of the rosary I had drawn from my jacket pocket. As I advanced toward him, I saw the grave rites surrounding me trying to strike, but they were unable to pass the invisible barrier protecting me. When the necromancer struck his staff against the ground, the roots of the oak tree erupted from the earth like venomous snakes to block my path. I hesitated for a moment. This was not merely a trick, but a horrific moment where nature itself was forced into the service of evil. "You are a soul created by the divine," I roared. "How can you serve such darkness?" The man only laughed. "I do not serve, watchman. I am the darkness itself." At that moment, I realized his body was gradually becoming transparent. It wasn't made of flesh and bone, but was merely a projection, an illusion. It was a deception. The real necromancer was here, but he was hidden. I sensed a disturbance in the soil. There was something buried exactly where he stood. I flung the rosary beads at that spot and began to recite the final verses of the scriptures with a power that echoed throughout the graveyard, my voice unwavering. The moment the beads touched the earth, that black fire extinguished with a shrill shriek. The necromancer's illusion dissolved like smoke into the air, accompanied by a pained moan. The army of creatures around me began to scurry aimlessly like soldiers who had lost their commander, and within moments they retreated back into the depths of the earth, into the darkness to which they belonged. When silence reclaimed the cemetery, I collapsed to my knees. I was drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I looked up, I found a small, rusted metal box half buried in the soil where that figure had been standing. On the box were carved protection and curse sigils in an ancient, indecipherable tongue that clouded the mind just by looking at them. I took the box back to my hut, but I dared not open it. I knew it held the key to why Blackwood Cemetery was such a nexus of dread. With the first light of dawn, I carried the box to a forgotten underground cistern, a place I knew lay beneath the deepest part of the cemetery where no one had set foot for ages. I buried it there, placed a heavy stone on top, and ensured it would remain a place of oblivion. Yet, after that day, the peace of the dead in the cemetery was shattered. It was no longer just the entities. Even the souls beneath the soil began to grow restless, as if fleeing from some unfathomable terror. During my midnight patrols, I began to hear sobbing, moaning, and relentless whispering rising from between the headstones. These were not the fake, deceptive sounds I had heard before. These were the desperate lamentations of the souls trapped beneath the earth. One night, while standing by the grave of Miss Evelyn, the town's beloved young teacher, who had died far too soon, a whisper reached me from within the soil. "Do not leave us. They are coming." Who were they? For days and nights, I waited in the dark corners of the graveyard for an answer. Finally, on a night when the moon was completely wiped from the sky, a massive dark vortex appeared beyond the boundaries of the cemetery, as if a gate to another dimension had ripped open. From this vortex poured forth entities that resembled human forms but were completely featureless, woven from pure abyssal darkness. They were not mere spirits or demons. They were like harbingers of torment descended upon the earth. They were attempting to harvest the souls within the cemetery. I acted immediately. If these souls were taken, this sacred ground would become nothing more than a pile of corpses. I began to run round the graves, chanting every ancient prayer of protection I knew, crying out with a faith as loud and unshakable as a scream. Meanwhile, I was igniting the mixtures of blessed salt and sage I had prepared and hidden in every corner of the cemetery. As the smoke drifted toward those entities, they shattered like breaking glass. Yet, their numbers were so vast that I could not keep pace. In that moment, the ancient guardians, those whom Father Thomas had often spoken of, came to my aid. Invisible hands began to repel those creatures as if an entire army stood beside me. I could not see them with my eyes, but I knew they were there from the weight on my shoulders and the unshakable shield of protection surrounding me. That night, I realized I was no longer just a cemetery watchman. I was a true protector of these hallowed grounds. My prayers blocked the harbingers of torment from entering the cemetery. The vortex closed just before the break of dawn, and everything returned to silence. Since that day, every morning at sunrise, I walked to every single headstone in the cemetery and bid them peace. I know now that death is merely a veil, a beginning. We, the living, are simply the gatekeepers of that other realm. There are still secrets in this cemetery, still the legacy of those ancient warlocks. But I am here, and by the grace of the divine, I will not allow any evil force to cross that threshold. I am no longer alone. Every tree in this graveyard, every tombstone, and every soul beneath the soil stands watch with me. When midnight strikes, I am not just a guard. I am a confidant, a guardian watching over the life and death behind that iron gate. And I know now that no matter how deep the shadows, a heart sealed with faith fears no darkness in this world. This is my duty, this is my destiny, and this is my sacred trust, which I shall uphold until my final breath.